Welcome back to the program. Syrian Girl, Miram, how are you? Great to see you again.
Thanks for having me on the show. I'm glad to be back.
And you know, I think most people here in the United States are generally confused and misinformed about what's going on in Syria. We've all heard President Trump's latest announcement that he's going to withdraw, draw down, whatever it is that he's intending to do. I feel like we've heard statements like this before, and I really wanted to speak to you because you always have such great insights. You're so well informed and articulate about the complex situation going on there in Syria. What can you tell us about this latest development?
Well, I go ahead and I talk for a very long time about this, and I'm gonna try to keep it short. But it is a multi-sided war. Maybe you could think of it as a Mexican standoff, and there might be three sides: Syria, Iran, Russia on one side, the US and the Kurds on another, and Turkey and the FSA on another. The FSA being the Syrian insurgents. But at the same time, the US supports the FSA, and Russia and Syria are not against the Kurds. So it's like a Mexican standoff, but yeah, well, actually, yeah, it's a Mexican standoff.
So perhaps in that case, maybe Donald Trump can get Mexico to pay for this.
Yeah. Well, he didn't have much luck with the wall, so
right.
I think Mexico would protest loudly.
And I don't mean to make light of it. It's obviously a very serious situation. I think really people in the United States don't know what the history is of this Kurds, the group the Kurds. We've heard about them in Iraq. We heard that Saddam Hussein used gas against the Kurds. They always seem to be coming up, but we don't really know much about the Kurds other than what we hear on the news. And I know that you know quite a bit about the history of Syria. Maybe we should start by understanding a bit of that.
Absolutely. Well, actually, to be honest, when the war began, I was perhaps just as ignorant about who the Kurds are as everybody else was. And it took some investigation on my own, past all the rhetoric and propaganda we're fed, to reach the point that I'm at now. So it's completely understandable if people either have misconceptions or no conceptions, because the media isn't really going to educate you about it. Before the war, I too was exposed to these same ideas that the Kurds are perpetual victims. They were victimized because they were robbed of nation statehood by Sykes-Picot, who divided their historic Kurdistan into 4 different countries. And since then, they've been trying to struggle to create their united Kurdistan country. The reality is very, very different, I came to find. There never was a Kurdistan in the entirety of history. And so there was no Kurdistan from which could have been divided. The regions where did the Kurds come from if there was no Kurdistan?
Yeah.
They are an Iranian speaking, they speak an Iranian dialect, and they're an Iranian people. Iran has a lot of different ethnic groups that speak different dialects, and Kurds just happen to be one of them. And if you take, for example, Saudi Arabia, you would notice that they have a Bedouin community that, even though they're Arab, they live a nomadic lifestyle. And in the same way, Kurds lived a nomadic lifestyle up until World War I, which is something that I read on CNN and BBC and the Washington Post, but it's somewhere buried in the article.
Exactly.
It's not really in the headline. So what that means is, what does being nomadic mean? It means that other than Iran, from which they originate, they've never settled on land. They've never built cities. They've never built roads. They've never created or claimed territory, because they move around and they happen to have moved into these four different countries. That's why they're in Turkey, in Iraq, and minimally in Syria, because they followed mountain ranges, herding, I think, goats or sheep, and they live near mountainous regions. And the Zagros mountains moved into Turkey. So, but there are no mountains in northeast Syria. I think we'll get to that later. So the fact of the matter is that this is the reason why there was never a Kurdistan, and there still isn't one. Because like Bedouins, like gypsies, nomads don't usually care for borders. But you can't really have it both ways. You can't have your cake and eat it too. You can't say, well, I don't respect other people's borders, but I want to draw my own borders on other people's territory. They want to claim, for example, they claim now North Iraq, but in reality, North Iraq was historically the land of Sumerians and Assyrians. And Assyrians are definitely an ethnic group that still exists and are still living in Iraq and have far more of a historical claim to the region that is now called Kurdistan. The east of Turkey has probably the highest population of Kurds. And that used to be largely populated by Armenians, and it was part of what was Armenia. However, the reason why it's no longer Armenia is because of the Armenian genocide. And I came to learn that, in fact, the Kurds participated in the Armenian genocide with the promise by Turkey that they were going to take over the houses of the Armenians that they ethnically cleanse. And that's why around World War I, they stopped being nomadic. Wow. So this claim of like a historical territory of Kurdistan and this victim narrative is one which is just really pushed by people who want to destabilize the Middle East. And, as painful as this all sounds, especially for, people who don't like to accept facts because they want to hold on to what they've been taught. And this is you can look, everything I've told you is open source information. So I encourage everyone to look for it.
And you know what? I learned about it from watching your really excellent YouTube channel. I should mention that we are doing a simulcast of this broadcast on Syrian Girl Partisan, the YouTube channel that Miran is broadcasting from. And people can watch over there. Miran is very knowledgeable about the history of Syria, the Kurds, this genocide of Armenians I didn't know anything about, but there seems to be a really centuries-long history in this region of battles and genocides and one group hating the other group, and it seems really strange for the United States, which 200 or 300 years we've been around. These are factions that have been at war literally for millennia, and we're coming in there and trying to tell them what to do. In the graphic for today, I've included Erdogan, the leader of Turkey. Donald Trump has kind of paved the way for Turkey to take over whatever it is that's going on there in Syria. How do you feel about that, Miran? That doesn't necessarily sound so good. Do we like Erdogan and Turkey being in Syria?
Well, the thing is that Turkey and Erdogan are already in Syria. So of course we don't like them being in Syria, but the US doesn't have any problem with them being west of the Euphrates. They only have a problem with Turkey going east of the Euphrates. Otherwise, we would have had this fanfare and strong reaction when the Turkey invaded Afrin and Idlib. But we didn't hear anything about that. So what is this really about? This is the reason that the US or the establishment media is very upset about the Turkish invasion. And of course, the Syrian state opposes both the US and the Turkish invasion and want both those occupations to end. There's no doubt about that. But the reason why the mainstream media is so opposed to Turkey is not out of concern for the Kurds. Let's face it, the neocons don't really care about
Right.
anyone's lives.
Yeah. Well, money and themselves.
They're afraid that the Kurds and Russia and Iran. That is their biggest fear. They would sincerely prefer Turkey to wipe out every last Kurd than have them ally with Syria and Iran and allow the Syrian army to go east of the Euphrates, because then it's game over. It means that Syria will be reunified and the US's entire agenda for Syria would be over, and Balkanization was part of that agenda. So this is the real reason why they're angry, because once the US allows Turkey to go in, and as far as I understand, they are already going into some parts of Syria in the east of the Euphrates, the Kurds are eventually maybe going to get it into their heads that the US isn't going to, well, at least Trump doesn't want to destroy NATO over this. You know, some parts of the US establishment may want to destroy NATO over this, but not Trump. So if they can accept this, then they perhaps will finally allow the Syrian military to take back its own territory and defend against both, you know, the coming Turkish invasion.
Well, that's the thing. All the reporting that I'm seeing, like the Associated Press this morning, is categorizing this as the United States stepping aside for a Turkish assault on Kurds in Syria. That doesn't sound like a step towards peace. I mean, I think a lot of people in the United States are still sort of trying to unravel this. On the surface, it seems like we like this idea. Donald Trump campaigned in part on pulling our troops out of these foreign wars. And I mean, frankly, Miram, you're the only Syrian person I've ever met, and I like you. I've got no beef with Syria. I would hate to see anything bad happen in Syria. I mean, it's, to me, just a country that's over there doing its thing. I don't think we want U.S. troops in there. No need to bomb anybody. But this seems like basically Donald Trump is just handing it off to Erdogan and allowing him to do whatever he wants.
Well, you know, it's not the best case scenario. The best case scenario is he hands it over to the Syrian army, but there's no chance of that happening. Imagine how, if heads are blowing over him handing over Syrian territory to Erdogan. Imagine what the reaction would be if he cedes it to the Syrian army. So we can't expect that. But a U.S. pullout is something that we've been advocating for years, and supposedly some of these more liberal folks that are supposedly anti-war were also advocating for the end of the U.S. occupation of Syria. But now suddenly they're shy about it.
Right.
Now there's silence and fear because sympathy, and the idea is that's being pushed is we have to protect the Kurds, you have to have sympathy for the Kurds. But where's the sympathy for the other minorities in the northeast of Syria that were ethnically cleansed by the Kurds, like the Assyrian Christians and the Arabs and the Turkmens? You know, there doesn't seem to be any room for sympathy for those minorities. And it's just completely crocodile tears. There are some people falling for it. They're falling for the same humanitarian intervention trap that led to the war on Libya. And it's astonishing to see the psychology that's being used to manipulate people into this. But there's nothing, what will happen is that the Kurds will go to Damascus for protection. Nothing untoward or bad is going to happen to them if they agree to do that, because the Syrian military will be there to protect them. And the Syrian military will be able to protect them far better than the U.S. can, because the U.S. can't fire a bullet at Turkey, but the Syrian military certainly can. So by being there, the U.S. is actually preventing the Syrian military from protecting the Kurds. It's a complete reversal of reality. What they're afraid of, what the neocons are afraid of, is that the Kurds will turn to Assad. They're not afraid of the Kurds getting killed. And they're just selling you this lie because, you know, they know that most people are good. and they exploit that, and it's disgusting.
So I'm a bit confused. The Kurds, they're welcomed in Syria, or they're causing problems for Syria? You're saying the Syrian army will protect them.
Well, the Syrian Kurds are Syrian. If they have Syrian citizenship, then they're Syrian. And so, of course, the Syrian army is going to protect its own citizens. The Kurds, when we say Kurds, do we mean Kurdish civilians, or do we mean the YPG, or do we mean Kurds that joined ISIS? You know, we're using Kurds very generally because the media has kind of pushed us into that. When I'm talking about the Kurds, I don't just mean the Kurdish civilians.
Right.
I'm even talking about inclusive of the Kurdish militia that the U.S. has been protecting. Because the Syrian military doesn't want to open a new front with the Kurdish militias. They would rather work this out amicably and have them join the ranks of the Syrian army, for example. The only problem we have with Kurds is if they were Turkish or Iraqi Kurds that have illegally crossed into Syria to fight their fight and, you know, create a state out of Syrian territory. Those people will have to leave. But Syrian Kurds are Syrian, even though some of them have betrayed Syria by collaborating with an occupation. That's certainly not the civilians' fault. So, of course, the Syrian military will protect them from a coming Turkish invasion that's coming into Syrian territory.
Wow. So it seems like this is another case where the news, the media, the mainstream, the military, they want us all to put people in boxes, right? They want it to be Kurds versus Syrians versus Americans versus whatever. People like to have that kind of us versus them compartmentalized sort of a thing, because when you actually sit down and speak to someone from another country or of another religion, as long as both parties aren't psychotic killers, whatever religion they are, most people really just want to have a pleasant life with their family, have a country where they can have a job and prosperity and just have a nice time and not necessarily kill each other. And whatever religion somebody might be, whatever race somebody might be, there are crazy people within there. So it's interesting to sort of try to dissect these things. We've heard some really terrible things in the media and from Twitter, which, you know, these politicians now become direct sort of conduits to this, you know, fake news cycle. I mean, when I see Bashar Assad and his wife, they look to me like a very pleasant couple who you'd see on the cover of People magazine or something like that. And we've heard from people in the region that Assad is very well liked, but yet Lindsey Graham and others are advising Donald Trump to basically blow him up in the same way that Ronald Reagan tried to blow up Gaddafi, which we've now heard many times over that people in Libya loved Gaddafi and everything we ever heard about him was a lie. What's the general consensus in Syria with regard to Bashar Assad and his wife?
Well, there certainly wasn't any ISIS in Libya while Gaddafi was around. So Lindsey Graham, it's interesting. That tweet that he wrote about taking out Assad was during the Trump impeachment thing, and during the time Pompeo was claiming that the U.S. now believes Syria used chlorine to clean their pool. Just kidding. But yeah, it's gotten to the point where they don't even care about trying to prove that it's sarin anymore. They're just gonna go with chlorine. It's easier that way. Nobody's gonna know the difference, right? So so isn't it interesting that this has all happened at the same time as Trump's impeachment? It's almost like they had a feeling that Trump was intending to pull out, and so they created this whole impeachment thing, and then they gave him a carrot and stick, and they were demanding that he goes against the Syrian military and applies force to them. Because I believe that the US really thought they could pressure Assad into accepting federalism into the constitution, just like Iraq did after Saddam was taken out and the US took over. They pushed federalism into the constitution. But Assad is never going to do that. I mean, when the US went into Syria, they had a list of things they wanted to do. They wanted to get rid of WMDs, ferment sectarianism, and then balkanize the country. So they got rid of the WMDs, but the balkanizing, that's not seeming to stick, because the only way that they can maintain it is by having US troops permanently there, and then Turkey is going to start getting more and more agitated and perhaps leave NATO, because now they're being pushed far into the Russian sphere of influence as this thing has progressed. So this is also, if you recall, the Syrian Constitutional Committee had been formed by the United Nations recently, just around the time this whole thing was happening, and the Kurdish SDF was complaining that they're not part of the Constitutional Committee, and this Syrian spokesman Muallim said, well, they're not a part of this. Like, what makes them think they're a part of this? Syria is not going to put federalism in the constitution, okay? And I think the US thought, well, maybe someone like Lindsey Graham or Pompeo thought that they could pressure Assad with some bombs into accepting some kind of federalism in the constitution. Without federalism, the US's presence in Syria is not going to be legitimate. It's not tenable, and at the same time, they have Turkey pressuring them, and I think Trump gets it. The same situation 10 months ago when he tried to pull out, and now it's 10 months later. Nothing has changed for the United States in Syria. They're still facing the same thing, only it's worse, because Syria is getting rid of al-Qaeda in Idlib, and Turkey is getting closer to Russia. Their relationship is breaking down. So even if Trump decides not to pull out completely or not to, it's still nothing is gonna. He's gonna have to pull out eventually. Like, this is like a sunk cost, or if you're a gambling person, you keep more money into the pile,
after bad,
but you have a losing hand.
Right. So I think a lot of people in the United States are definitely left wondering, because, it's like Trump said he was going to pull out of Syria, and then nothing happened, and nothing's been said about that. I think you might be right that the whole, I don't know if the impeachment was brought about because of what Trump is doing in Syria, but it seems clear that the establishment in the United States does not want Trump to be the president. They're hopeful, I think, that anything that they can even suggest will disrupt his re-election campaign. What do people in Syria generally think about Donald Trump and what he's done, and is he good for Syria or bad for Syria? And how does the UN come to announce a constitutional committee? I mean, I don't know how people in the United States would feel if some external body decided they didn't like the way our country was running and we're going to create a new constitution with this guy who is the UN Secretary General, I guess, is he Italian? Antonio Guterres?
Yeah. Well, isn't it insane to suggest that a foreign country write your nation's constitution? And Syria is not accepting that. Syria said they will only accept a Syrian-led committee to write the constitution. All the other countries are going to be on the periphery. At the end of the day, Assad said it himself in an interview once. I don't remember with that famous journalist woman, I forget her name. He said, the United Nations is just a game we play, and this is just a game. The Syria is going to go through the motions of the United Nations. They're just going to do whatever they want at the end. It's what they always do.
Yeah. Maybe Vanessa Beeley, would that have been?
She's an older woman, like with 60 Minutes or.
Christiane Amanpour.
Oh no, please, not her. No, she's a much sweeter older lady. This interview was pre-war. It was in. I will probably remember later and kick myself. I thought maybe Goodman was the last name, but no, that's not it either.
I don't know who we're thinking about.
But the point. is still the same.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate. Syria is one of these countries that's just kind of trying to live its life as a country. They're a secular government. Bashar Assad does not appear in a military uniform or a religious uniform, and we've got all religions sort of living somewhat in harmony in Syria, right? People in the United States really don't have a clear idea, I think, of what really goes on in Syria and how people feel.
Someone commented Barbara Walters. Yes,
Okay, there we go.
Barbara Walters. There's the one. Yeah. Well, obviously, having a secular government in a country with a lot of different religions and ethnic groups is for the better. So I think that the US public can't even imagine that their own government spent the last 9 years supporting Al Qaeda in an attempt to overthrow a secular government. But they shouldn't be surprised because this is what happened in Libya.
Yeah.
It's what happened in Afghanistan in the 80s. And look at the Iraq War. I mean, even in the Iraq War's case, they removed Saddam, who was secular, and replaced him with the Dawa Party, which is a Shiite-led government. And they're doing this on purpose because a secular country is stronger in many ways because it doesn't have infighting. We can push forward like a Sunni state in Syria, then it could be in perpetual warfare with Iran, for example. And then they can sell guns and they can have their little wars because wars are now fought on the playing field of the Middle East rather than the playing or East Europe, like in Ukraine, rather than in another avenue.
Turkey is
that's
mentioned so frequently when we're talking about what's going on in Syria, and now that the United States is essentially handing it off to Turkey, this seems like a major concern to me. I don't know much about the politics in Turkey, but when Erdogan came to Washington, D.C., it seems like his bodyguards were just beating people up in the street, which is a little bit kind of crazy. And there was this recent article in The Intercept that Turkey has become a drone power, a killer drone power. And apparently there's some drone factory owned by Erdogan's daughter. We've seen Turkish drones being shot down in Libya. I mean, this drone technology, you can go over to B&H Photo and pick up a video surveillance drone. Certainly, it seems like this kind of technology is readily accessible. Is this the new thing that's going to be happening in Syria, Turkish drone attacks?
Well, to be honest, the drone thing is everywhere. I don't think it's just Turkey. I mean, like drone warfare is going to be the new kind of warfare, perhaps. It's like the invention of the tank. It's going to change everything. I don't think it's just Turkey specifically. And I know that Turkey, of course, is, Erdogan has this Muslim Brotherhood allegiance, and that's why he supported the insurgency in Syria. But at the same time, in the least, he does want to maintain the territorial integrity of Syria, unlike the United States. And it's interesting. I think it's more important to ask. Turkey is one of the US's most important allies because it's one of the strongest militaries in NATO. Why are they putting so much at risk for Turkey? Which brings me to another one of your questions, which I don't think I answered properly. What do Syrians think of Trump? Trump has been like a very chaotic president. You don't know if he's coming or going. Does he want to pull out of Syria? Doesn't he? As far as Syria is concerned, we have to look at what he's done. And he did the Golan Heights thing for Netanyahu, where he declared the Golan Heights to be Israeli territory when, under international law, that land is Syrian land and still has Syrians living in it. This goes completely against what's good for Syria, and yet he's doing this pullout. So, it's really, we don't know what to think of this guy. So, and in terms of Turkey, again, why would the US be so in opposition to Turkey? I mean, I don't think they care about Erdogan's politics, because they have no problem with making friends with Saudi Arabia. I mean, Trump is very close to Saudi Arabia,
right,
especially business-wise. Even though, before he got elected, he wrote books about Saudi Arabia funding terrorism and being behind 9/11. But so it's not about religion or ideology. They don't care about that, and they certainly don't care about Erdogan killing Kurds, because the US declared the PKK a terrorist organization and supported Turkey against Kurdish separatists for decades. So what is this really about? And I think this goes back to largely the Öcalan plan of trying to create a Kurdistan, because by destabilizing countries and creating perpetual warfare between these statelets of Israel.
Sorry, we lost you a bit there, Miran. By creating statelets, by balkanizing Syria, what is the purpose?
It basically creates perpetual warfare between these. In the Öcalan plan that was written, it was said that
We're losing you here, and this is the most important part.
Oh,
sorry.
Shall I?
No, there we go. I've just stopped something that hopefully will improve it. So you were saying in the plan, say again, I'm sorry to ask you a third time.
So sorry about this. Okay. So why would the US choose the Kurds over Turkey? Turkey being one of the most powerful militaries in NATO, and the Kurds being a ragtag militia made up of 16-year-old girls. The idea is in the Öcalan plan, written in 1982, that suggested creating a Kurdistan, divide and conquer the Middle East, would create many statelets who are at perpetual war with each other and could no longer pose a threat towards Israel.
And we do know that Donald Trump is a big friend of Israel and also a friend of Saudi Arabia. It's so strange for people to understand and try and decipher what these different moves could possibly mean. I mean, you mentioned this Trump, proclaiming the Golan Heights to be the property of Israel. Again, it's so, I mean, if France came along and decided that Texas was the property of Mexico, how would people in the United States feel? It seems like such a strange thing for the United States to do. And Trump's actions towards Syria have been somewhat schizophrenic, firing missiles when we had that fake news about there being a gas attack that was so obvious to so many people that it wasn't even real. But then he stopped short of a full-blown war in that move, which I think most people were quite pleased about. He also fired John Bolton, which seemed like a very good thing, but then again, he did hire John Bolton, so it's, as you said, it's very difficult to understand what the hell Trump is trying to do here. John Bolton seems like a terrible guy in my estimation, and according to most of the people we've spoken with who have ever had any kind of firsthand dealings with him, he's not good. So I don't know. I mean, what's your personal opinion? Has the president been doing things that'll ultimately be helpful towards Syria, or is this just a disaster waiting to happen?
Well, it's at the if you're asking me right now, what he's doing right now is good for Syria ultimately, okay. And the CNN is admitting this. On a CNN headline I'm reading right now, Trump's betrayal of the Kurds is a gift to Putin and Assad. So they're speaking in forked tongues. I mean, one minute they tell us, oh, this is going to be terrible for the Kurds because Turkey's going to attack them. But we also admit that this is going to be good for Assad and Putin. which because the Kurds are going to be aligning with them, which is really what we really care about, by the way. Like, let's read between the lines here. It's on the headlines. It's open. So yeah, this is going to be good. Wow. It's very clear. It is going to be good for Syria. Even though, no matter what you think of Erdogan, the US pulling out of Syria is 100% good for Syria, because this means that the Syrian military has the potential to regain its oil fields, which means that we will be able to rebuild the country. Cannot rebuild without those oil fields. That's why the US has been preventing us from getting to them and sanctioning Syria. Because if you noticed, the only way that Syrians have been getting oil to fuel their cars is because Iran has been taking big oil tankers and driving them all like from the bottom of Africa to the top of Africa to get to the Mediterranean Sea and to bring it to Syria. And they've been getting blocked by the British, and I'm not sure where it was, over that. So I think some part of Spain yes, the tankers. Because there is this, if you go onto your internet right now and just look up fuel shortage in Syria, you will see tens and tens of hundreds of cars lining up at the fuel station because there's no fuel in a Middle Eastern country because the US is occupying Syria's oil fields in east of the Euphrates and not letting them get to that. So, and Iran was taking oil to Syria, and that's why they were blocking the tankers. So of course, if the US pulls out of Syria and the Syrian military can go into the oil fields, that will be good for Syria.
Wow. See, I'm so glad to have you here sharing this with us, Mehran, because even though this is published in the Wall Street Journal, I don't know, I'm not putting these pieces together, and it's incredibly important for us to do that. Now, you mentioned CNN. I don't know if this is ironic or what we should expect, but when I click on World, I would hope that the top story in the world is this handoff of power in Syria, but CNN, at least in New York, is leading with the nightmare for Manchester United, a football club sponsored by General Motors that I absolutely do not care about at all. I'm trying to find out what's going on in Syria, and they're telling me about what's going on with these footballers. It's absolutely bizarre how this is. Ben & Jerry's seems like more important news to CNN than what's going on in Syria. People are really trying to figure this out, but the information is essentially not here.
Well, exactly right. And I guess I know about the fuel shortages because I'm Syrian, and also I know people in Syria, and I know that fuel shortages have been a problem since the start of the war. So yeah, it's amazing how much information is controlled and it's disconnected. You don't get to hear it in such a simple way as, why did they stop the Iran oil tanker? Oh, because they want to break the embargo on Syria because Syria has no fuel.
Right.
And therefore they cannot fight Al-Qaeda in Idlib, and the US wants to stop them from fighting Al-Qaeda in Idlib by preventing the army from getting the fuel that it needs to do so. So it's very, they could say this very simply in exactly the same amount of seconds that I've said it here, but they won't. They won't talk about that. So
well, and it's nice that we're able to have this type of discussion where you've got adequate time to explain this and answer these pretty obvious questions. I mean, when this Iran oil tanker happened with Britain first stopping, I feel like we got a lot of information from, in the alternative media. I was hearing a lot of stuff about QAnon and follow the plan and whatever, but nobody explaining it clearly in the way that you just did. It's part of the reason why it's super important for people who are watching us right now, Mehran, to support the type of independent journalism that you're doing. I'm showing everybody your YouTube channel right now where we are simulcasting today's broadcast for the first time, and thank you for assisting me in doing that. I think it's a great way to get the word out. But even more important, if people are watching us right now on YouTube or Facebook or DLive or Periscope, make your way over to patreon.com/Syrian Girl and become a Patreon sponsor of Miram on her Syrian Girl Patreon page. It is an absolutely great way to stay up to date with the real news of what is going on in Syria. Miram is in constant contact with her friends and family over there. And of course, this is the type of information that the billionaires who own CNN, the New York Times, the Washington Post, they don't want you to have this. They want little fragmented pieces of nonsense to be sort of assembled in a confusing puzzle that keeps the people of America in the dark and fighting over what Adam Schiff thinks Donald Trump should be impeached over. So I'm really pleased to have you here demystifying this for us. What else should we know about what's going on?
Oh, well, I'm reading some of the comments that are being posted. First of all, one person said if Syria just removed Iran, then all of this bad stuff would go away. That was really the point. If the U.S. is one of the reasons the U.S. destabilized Syria and tried to put al-Qaeda or the Muslim Brotherhood in power there is to drive a wedge between Syria and Iran. At that time, in 2011, just before, Syria was friendly with Iran and Turkey, but obviously they didn't like that relationship, and that's why they were doing it. And I think that's because of the resistance crescent, or the axis of evil, as the U.S. would call it, which poses a threat, they believe, to Israel. So that's why they want to get rid of Iran. Now, that's not saying that I agree with Iran's theocracy. Obviously, I don't believe in theocracies, but I also accept that Syria needs its allies now more than ever to fight against al-Qaeda. So to suggest that we'll just get rid of Iran, no. Who helped Syria fight ISIS? Who's helping Syria still fight al-Qaeda? Iran's not going anywhere.
And I don't think we should lose sight of the fact that WikiLeaks revealed in Hillary Clinton's own email message to John Podesta, she says openly that Saudi Arabia and Qatar are funding ISIS in Libya. They were running weapons, according to the Moriartys. Christopher Stevens was overseeing a plan to bring 50,000 shoulder-mounted rockets into Syria through Libya. So they've been planning this, war for such a long time. It seems like Donald Trump, as schizophrenic as his policy may be, is in there messing up a plan that Hillary Clinton, Barack Obama, and their supporters had in place for a long, long time to just sow destruction throughout the Middle East, take over these oil reserves, take control of this gas pipeline that Syria controls that brings Russian natural gas through Syria, up through Turkey and into Europe. This is all a big economic play, and by fracturing the story and creating these, partisan players on each side, I know you've been very outspoken against Bernie Sanders for his hypocritical support of, one day he's anti-war, one day he's pro-Israel, one day he's hanging out with Linda Sarsour. He's kind of all over the map.
Yes. I believe he's controlled opposition. I don't know what you think, but I'm a big supporter of a one-state solution where everybody is equal citizens. And I do feel that the two-state solution is just no longer possible. And people who are like Bernie Sanders, who are pushing for the idea that a two-state solution is even possible, and Chomsky being one of them, where are they right now on Syria? When it comes to the U.S. finally ending one of its wars, they're opposed. They want the U.S. to remain in the perpetual war.
Right.
So what am I to think of this kind of person? I prefer to look at people's actions, and especially in a time of crisis, rather than the kind of figure that they paint themselves out to be. And Ilhan Omar is another one of those. Ilhan Omar is also wanting the U.S. to stay in Syria perpetually. And she's supposed to be, in her tweet, she's like, I'm against perpetual wars, but we need to be in a perpetual war because
Yeah.
otherwise it's going to be good for Russia. So, like, the hypocrisy knows no boundaries.
Well, Ilhan Omar is certainly a hypocrite. I mean, she claims to be a pious religious woman, but yet she's having sex with some other lady's husband, and now she's getting divorced, and she married her brother and everything like that. I personally don't get very involved in the conversation about one state, two state. I just don't know that much about the politics or history of the region, so any opinion that I have would be fairly ignorant. What I am able to observe is that it seems like there are similarities between this situation of the nomadic Kurds who are present in Iraq, they're present in Syria, and they're looking for a state, or that's what we're told the purpose is. And then we've also got a similar situation with Palestinians who want a state and are arguing with Israel. So we've got like the Kurds in Syria, the Palestinians in Israel. I personally just want everybody to hang out and not kill each other and have a good time. Whether that means one state that they're all in, two states that they're all in, I don't know the solution, but definitely creating these wars and the deception involved in creating these wars, where we say, you know, the United States is fighting ISIS, but at the same time we see John McCain and other not so distant people who have been in our memory from not so long ago actually funding terrorism and funding ISIS, funding al-Qaeda, al-Nusra, whatever these groups are, basically stoking the flames of all these wars in these different countries. It doesn't seem to be true to what they say.
Well, I think that they get the left wing to support the Kurdish cause by drawing parallels to the Palestinian one, stateless people, stateless
Right.
people. But as a matter of fact, I think the Kurdish cause is far more similar to the Israeli one rather than the Palestinian one, especially before like Israel became a state where Jewish refugees were going into Palestine from World War II, and there was discussion about these people needing a state. There's a victims thing attached to the Kurds, as well as there was with the Jews coming out of World War II. So there's far more parallels to draw in that sense. And in the same way, like at the beginning when Israel was first created, people like actually Bernie Sanders himself and Noam Chomsky themselves were promoting it as a sort of Marxist, socialist, democratic haven that's going to be for all ethnicities. And Kurdistan is being promoted in the same way. They're saying it's going to be a Marxist, democratic, thing for all ethnicities. It's the same, like that's how they feed it to the left. And they, of course, when they turn to the right, they feed it to them in a completely different way about, oh, this is a nationalist cause, about people regaining their own territory. But if we just step back a bit, this is about dividing people. It's about empires finding cracks and creating statelets and people to create perpetual war. If there was a one-state solution, for example, where there would be equal rights for all people in Palestine, Israel, Israeltime, that's what Gaddafi called it, whatever you want to call it. If everybody had equal rights under a secular government that granted, everybody the same, they didn't discriminate against people, then there is not going to be any way to sell weapons and make the place a hellhole for everyone that's completely unsafe with people dying and all the time. So that's why Britain agreed to this whole thing in the first place. That's why they stood up Pakistan and India.
Well, did they agree to it, or did they come up with it? I think Britain might have been the one. Exactly. So I'm so glad to have you here, Mehran, because you know so much more about this than I do. And even in that simple statement that I just made, the people who are commenting now are pointing out what I don't know about the situation. But what I agree with is it's all being created to just perpetuate this infighting. It's a very Marxist, Saul Alinsky type approach where you pit one side against the next, and you rub raw the sores of discontent, so that while everybody's fighting, those people orchestrating the fight sort of hover above it and benefit from the losses on both sides. And I feel like, you know, we're very close to the facts here, where these different situations are created. Even the creation of the State of Israel and the making of it as a Jewish state is inherently inflammatory to people who are going to be, you know, predisposed to disliking Jewish people, and creating a Palestinian state will be inherently inflammatory to people who are predisposed to disliking them. The strangest aspect of it is that these outside countries like the United Kingdom and the United States and the United Nations and the International Criminal Court, we just sort of bully our way in there and start telling these thousands of year-old cultures what to be doing, and then make up all these fake stories to convince the people in the United States and the United Kingdom and elsewhere that their money, their tax dollars are being spent in a way that they're going to approve of, because everything that we're being told is a lie.
Exactly right. And there's so many lies. You know, you break down one lie and they come up with another. You know, I am reading some of the comments here, like Muslims are not going to give Jews equal rights and Jews can't give equal. Like, this is, there's always going to be bad people in every group.
Right.
That doesn't mean that we can't put the good people in control.
Right.
You know, Assad is a Muslim, if you consider Alawites Muslim. Some people do, some people do. I guess I do. And his wife is Sunni Muslim. So, and they have a secular state. If you believe in secularism, or at least pluralism, if you believe in that, then it doesn't really matter what your religion is. If you implement it, then you're on my side. You know, it's the people who are divisive on any side, whether it's ISIS or, you know, these other extremists that are promoting the genocide of Palestinians, for example. You know, these are people that we should marginalize, and especially ISIS. And who fought ISIS? You know, it was other Muslims. So I don't think we should be so pessimistic about the Middle East in that sense. I do think that anyone can be divided and conquered. Europe certainly was in World War II and World War I.
Yeah, and they seem to be spending a lot of time and effort and resources in trying to destroy much of the Middle East. You know, you mentioned the Muslim Brotherhood, and just in our last couple minutes here, I wanted to ask you a bit more about that. We heard not long ago that Muslim Brotherhood member and former president of Egypt, Mohamed Morsi, died in a glass box in court. And I don't know if you've heard too much about this, but he was a close friend of Hillary Clinton. And, you know, a lot of people might not be aware that shortly after Mohamed Morsi collapsed and died in a glass box in court, shortly after saying he was going to reveal damning information, very likely about Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama, his 25-year-old son also died of a heart attack. What, if anything, do you know about this situation, Miran?
At risk of never being able to step foot in Egypt, I think it's pretty suspicious. And I think probably Sisi is behind his death. Not that, you know, I care very much about Morsi. The last thing he ever said in his presidency was, we need to support the insurgency in Syria against Assad. And that was when the Egyptian military decided his days were up, because now he was going to create problems within Egypt and drag Egypt into the war. So that is literally the last thing he ever did in his presidency before he was taken into prison. I do think that he was probably assassinated. And what you guys have to understand in Egypt is it's basically under military rule this last few decades. And Qatar and Clinton and Obama wanted the Muslim Brotherhood to take power in Egypt. There's no question. Saudi Arabia, on the other hand, sees the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat. And this is something that people will not understand until they realize that the Muslim Brotherhood runs under a pseudo-democratic system, which means Erdogan was democratically elected, so was Morsi. You know, they believe in a democratic republic kind of system, whereas Saudi Arabia is a monarchy, and they see Muslim Brotherhood as a threat to their power. And if you look at ISIS and Al-Qaeda, you always hear he is the emir of ISIS, or he's the emir of ISIS in Syria or Iraq. What is an emir? It's a king or a queen. It's like it's running by a monarchy system, which is what sets the Muslim Brotherhood apart from, you know, ISIS and Al-Qaeda, which obviously Saudi Arabia has no fear of promoting. Not to say that the Muslim Brotherhood is a good thing, I'm just talking about the nuance of the situation and why you might, you know, people don't see that Turkey and Saudi Arabia are not friends right now, and whatever is happening in Egypt is a reflection of that, and reflection of that alone.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people in the United States don't really understand that, you know, those detailed aspects of it very well. I am certainly suspicious of the Muslim Brotherhood. We've spoken on this show many times about this explanatory memorandum that was recovered by the FBI after a raid of a home in Virginia resulted in several people being arrested for planning terrorist acts and whatnot. This document basically explains how the Muslim Brotherhood intends to do a cultural jihad in the United States, infiltrating Congress. And when we see people like Ilhan Omar, who, irrespective of her religion or her political views, seems like an extremely dishonest, double-talking liar, I become concerned about that. One last thing. So we've got this guy who's
certainly, nobody wants the Muslim Brotherhood. Well, Syria certainly doesn't want the Muslim Brotherhood to take over their country.
Right.
So I don't think the Americans would want that either.
No, definitely not. And then when we come to Mohammed Morsi's son, who looks like the Egyptian Jake Gyllenhaal, he's 25 and he died of a heart attack. That's like very rare.
Yeah. Very rare. And I think they have a means by which to create heart attacks, because here's another interesting story. There was a Iraqi anthropologist who was writing a documentary with a woman about how the artifacts of Iraq were stolen during the Iraq War. So the looting of Baghdad and the museums, and where the artifacts ended up. And he was in his, you know, he was middle-aged, and he had a heart attack just before they were going to, you know, start releasing this or really working on it. And you know, that's suspicious. But then a week later, the female, 30-year-old female who he was working with also died of a heart attack. So that
rare.
Becomes a little bit rare and suspicious.
Yeah. And you know,
there must be something to it.
Must be something to it. I totally agree with you. And you know, Miram, I'm so pleased that we were able to do this simulcast today, because I think what it does is it helps us expand the reach of this information. You know, you've got an audience there in the Middle East and in the Asia Pacific area, and I think most of the Crowdsource the Truth audience is coming from the United States. So I don't know how many of your viewers are familiar with the Church Committee hearings of 1975, 1978, sometime around that time. But Senator Frank Church formed a committee to investigate some of the activities of the CIA. And during those congressional hearings, it was revealed that the CIA had developed a specific assassination weapon that fired ice pellets that were made of this specific type of poison that would induce a heart attack in the victim. So the pellet was shot. It's about the size of a sewing needle. It would penetrate the victim with the tiniest hole that was almost undetectable, and it would create a heart attack. Now, this was 1978, and this is the CIA admitting this, so we know they have programs to develop these type of clandestine assassination weapons. And I think that modern technology, you know, today there are all these EM weapons. We've heard about directed energy weapons. We've heard about 5G using phased array technology, how it can increase the surface temperature of somebody's skin by 130 degrees. There are a lot of people who tell me that electromagnetic weapons exist that can be targeted at an individual and can induce a stroke or rupture blood vessels or do any type of thing that would penetrate glass, that would induce a heart attack even in somebody who's 25. So I think the notion that these guys are being taken out is not crazy in the least. So it's something we can explore in a future conversation.
Well, I've definitely heard about that stuff. I was kind of interested. I was kind of a conspiracy buff before the war began, and I read about that stuff. So it's very, very interesting. But there is a guy that in the chat, Comrade King, he keeps asking the same question, and I hear you. I will reply to your comment from the live stream, Syrian opinion on US pullout. I will find it and I will reply to it, so don't worry.
Absolutely.
So just sorry about that. The chats are distracting me.
Yeah, no, we've got a lot of chat going on. We've got close to 1,000 people watching us right now between the people who are watching on Miram's channel, Syrian Girl Partisan on YouTube. People can catch the show over there. And really, the most important thing to do is to support Miram on Patreon. Go over to patreon.com/Syrian Girl and show her some love. Support the independent journalism, and we really need international independent journalists just like you, because how else are we getting this story? We've got to rely on the Washington Post, we've got to rely on CNN. They all have a political agenda. They all want to remove Donald Trump and perpetuate these wars, so we need independent voices like yours. Thank you so much for joining me today. I know it's getting very late there. Anything you wanted to say before we wrap it up for today?
No, just peace, let's hope for peace on earth. And
absolutely.
Thank you guys for listening, and I hope I didn't disappoint anyone in any way, and I hope it was good. So thank you for having me on your and suggesting this interview.
Yeah, no disappointment whatsoever. Quite the contrary. I think people are delighted to hear your insights and to see you again. It's been far too long. So thanks very much, Miram. Syrian Girl, lovely to have you, and I'll see everybody later today. Thanks for watching.
Thank you. Bye-bye.